layered mythology is basically when you have multiple layers to your mythology, as well as the impact of your mythology on your culture is something that the reader can see. So we in our world, we have, for example, the name Jason, which comes from, the Greek name Jason and the Argonauts. So you have the impact of mythology in the world. And if you look at our art, you can see the kind of art, the impact that mythology has had on art. And if you look at the way that mythology has been borrowed back and forth across nations with what we call syncretism, you can see that we have had one layer of mythology build on top of another, build on top of another. Now, obviously, as a world builder, you don't have kind of infinite time. You're not going to be able to build such a depth to it as we have in the real world. But what you can do is you can create the illusion of this being the case. And that's what we're going to talk about today. So first, as is our wont on this channel, we're going to talk about what this means in the real world and how we see it. So if we look at the basic mythological creation, there is almost always a creation myth for any given culture. There is almost always a hero's journey for any given culture, and there's almost always a end of the world scenario for any culture. Every culture, to some extent, has at least one heroic myth, a creation myth, and a end of the world myth. So when you're drawing up your cultures, if you give them at least one heroic myth and those two myths kind of bracketing the culture, you've already started building your mythology. Now the trick to layering is to say, okay, I have these 5 cultures who are close to each other. So I'm going to have one myth as the basis, right? This is the culture that first developed the myth. And then I'm going to have everybody else borrow from it and adjust it just a little bit. So this does a couple of things. One, obviously it reduces your workload because you're only actually creating one myth. But 2, it creates the feeling within your world of this layered reality. Like the way that the Romans borrowed from the Greek myths, the way the Greeks borrowed from the Persian myths, the way we borrowed from Egyptian myths. The way that these myths kind of spread and get borrowed, in the same way, you can replicate that by taking those 3 basic myths, your creation myth, your heroic myth, and your end of the world myth, and grouping them appropriately. Okay, so what you can also do, right, is think about your core beliefs. Now, the core beliefs of, say, your first culture or two, your core belief of a group of cultures is going to share a lot in common. They are going to probably, if one of them's polytheistic, probably others will be as well. And then you take that kind of grouping and you use that to inform your mythology. Dojan HD says in the chat, would the Epic of Gilgamesh be considered here as a myth? Yes, absolutely. The Epic of Gilgamesh is the first myth that we know about. It undoubtedly wasn't the first myth ever, but it was the first myth that was written down and survived until now. An interesting side note on that, the reason why the Epic of Gilgamesh survived until now was because it was used to teach scribes to write with. So we have so many extant copies of the Epic of Gilgamesh because scribes had so much homework. Like they had to keep writing to make the epic work, which is fantastic. And yeah, if you look at the Epic of Gilgamesh and you compare it to, say, Noah's flood in the Bible, it is very clear. It is very, very clear to see where that myth, where the one myth borrowed from, the biblical flood borrowed from the Epic of Gilgamesh. And that's exactly what I mean, is that kind of shared mythology. And there wasn't, there is no evidence for there having been a worldwide flood, at least not in that time period. But obviously, many civilizations were on the coast and they experienced floods. And that is why there are so many flood myths. So it is also worth thinking about whether you should have things like a flood myth and how the civilization survived it and so on in your heroic myth collection, because that is probably one of the things that is shared across many cultures. And that's probably one of the things that's not borrowed. Well, it would be borrowed within a region, but say across regions, it wouldn't necessarily be borrowed, and nor would it have to be borrowed, because it could simply be that the people experience floods so often that they tell this legend or a legend like it so much. Yeah, very much as Doge says, in many civilizations that spawned on river valleys, and it was unpredictable and flooded often. Now, what you also need to, so let's say you now have some of these myths. You've got your creation myths, you've got your afterlife myth, you've got your heroic myths in the middle, and now you need to start thinking about really embedding this stuff in the culture. And one of the ways in which you can do that is by means of holidays, rituals, and ceremonies. And one of the best examples that I have seen of doing this is Jacqueline Carey's Midwinter Masque, right, from the Cashil's trilogy. Now, I am going to try this sharing my content. Okay, so this is our introduction to the Midwinter Masque. This is from the first book, Cashil's Dart. The Midwinter Masque fell before my 10th birthday, for I was born in the spring, but the Duane elected that I should be allowed to attend. I was not, it seemed, to leave the night court without seeing it in full in all its splendor. Every house has its own masque at some point throughout the year, and each, I am told, is a splendid affair with a worthy history. But the Midwinter Masque is something different. Its roots are older than the coming of Elua, for it celebrates the passing of the old year and the return of the sun. And that's the only little bit of introduction that we have to the Midwinter Masque as such. But then we get to see the Midwinter Masque play out. And having been told that there are these ancient rituals, they are then shown to us. So we see the Winter Queen, and in who's kind of shown as an old woman and hobbling because it's winter. And then the Sun Prince comes in, signifying the return of the light, and he points his spear at the Winter Queen, and then she sheds her costume, and the princess, the spring princess, is born from this action of the Sun Prince. And that is then blended in with the mythology of Elua, to which we've already been introduced, and we see how that culture builds up. But this Midwinter Masque is a recurring theme throughout the books. In Cashil's Dart, we attend that first one with Phaedra, and then we attend another one with Melisande, which is also a very critical period. And then in the second book, there's another midwinter masque that we attend. It's a theme throughout the books. Every time there is a midwinter masque and its impact um, on the whole culture is very real. Wallabang asks, I'm not sure if I can stay for the whole stream. Will there be a recording of this later? Yes, absolutely. There will be a recording of this later. At least I hope this is also a recording. I hope so. I speak under a little bit of correction because this is my first time using this software and I might have set it up wrong. I'm going to just click this button as well. Okay. Yes, everything from here on will at least be recorded. So we are talking about layered mythology, and we've discussed how you take a mythology and you bring in festivals, and you make those festivals part of your culture's experience. So, we spoke about Kashil's Darts Festival, and I do the same thing in my world. So, I have a midwinter festival that's also layers of mythology. So, I have fire dancers who dance within a circle of the wheel because the wheel is the important religious artifact of the people who live up in the north. So, when you're building out your mythology, don't just stop at the mythos. Don't just stop at this is my creation story, or this is my flood story, or this is my heroic myth. Take that myth and say, okay, what holidays grow from it? How do I create a celebration around this? How do people mention this? What customs grow from it? Because doing that will make the myth feel much more real to your readers. And it also provides you with a way of showing your readers what the myth is about without laboriously telling them all about the myth. So it will let you have something happen in the books that people can experience and work within. And that will then also introduce them to all the mythical concepts you want to use. Then, of course, legends and tales form an important part of mythology. And I already spoke about the name Jason and how even that has, come through to us. Today, there are people called Jason who might not even know about the story of Jason and the Argonauts. But names are a very interesting way to introduce readers to the myths. Using names from myths helps the reader understand that, firstly, the myth is embedded within the culture, and secondly, it forms a great vehicle for showing the myth. So I'm going to share my screen again. At least I hope so. And I'm going to talk about Nymera. So Nymera is two things in George R.R. Martin's A Song on Ice and Fire. She is the wolf that Arya gets in I think it's the first chapter that they get the dire wolves of A Game of Thrones. And she is also this legendary queen of the Rhoynar people who helped found House Martell. So I'm just going to read the passage where Arya is telling us about how she named Nymeria and why. Nymeria was waiting for her in the guard room at the base of the stairs. She bounded to her feet as soon as she caught sight of Arya. Arya grinned. The wolf pup loved her, even if no one else did. They went everywhere together, and Nymeria slept in her room at the foot of her bed. If Mother had not forbidden it, Arya would gladly have taken the wolf with her to needlework. Let Septa Mordain complain about her stitches then. Nymeria nipped eagerly at her hand as Arya untied her. She had yellow eyes. When they caught the sunlight, they gleamed like two golden coins. Arya had named her after the warrior queen of the Rhoyne, who had led her people across the narrow sea. That had been a great scandal too. Sansa, of course, had named her pup Lady. Arya made a face and hugged the wolfling tight. Nymeria licked her ear and she giggled. Okay, so there we get a very brief introduction to the myth. So Martin shows us this myth matters to Arya. It's a story, a legendary heroic story that matters to the character, and matters enough to her that she named her dog, her wolf pup, which is important to her. She's named her after the central character of the myth. And this gives that myth so much more importance because we can immediately see that it has an impact on the characters of the world. It is clear that this myth is one that is appreciated by the characters of the world. So when you are struggling for names, it is worth going to your mythology and saying, okay, so I have my mythology, and can I pick a name from there? Is there some name I can take from there and utilize in order to name a character or a place or something like that, and to layer the myth into the world and to embed it in the culture and in the world and in the geography and so on. I just saw a stream of hearts come through, so I think that means that somebody enjoyed that commentary, and I'm glad that you did. Okay. So, we should also speak here about why we build myths, or why there are myths in a culture. Not why we build myths. We build myths because the culture feels incomplete without them, but why a culture has mythology. So the purpose of a culture, and I've actually just shot a video on this where I go into more detail on the heroic myth, but the purpose of a culture or myths is to illustrate the morals of a culture, oftentimes, right? So they'll be showing the fatal flaw of the culture, or they'll be showing like values the culture, its spouses, or so on. Now, here's the thing. That especially applies to origin stories. And you can see that so clearly in the Roman origin story, right? So the Roman origin story has the twins Remus and Romulus, and they, they're born and people want to kill them, and then they're taken in by the wolf, and they're raised by her. Lupa, I think, was the wolf's name. It's been a while since I read that particular one, but I think it was Lupa. And then they go to Rome. They have a fight about who should be in charge, and Romulus kills Remus, which is why the city is called Rome, which to me illustrates Rome's flaw. Rome tended to fight itself a lot. There was a lot of coups. And also, afterwards, Romulus basically threw open Rome to anybody who wanted to live there. Yes, there was the whole incident of the Sabian women that he actually kidnapped and forced to live there, but he pretty much called everyone Rome. He called everyone Roman. And I think that is one of the enduring strengths of the Roman Empire, and one of the reasons why they grew so big. Anybody could become a Roman citizen if they learned Latin. Right? It was possible to become a Roman citizen. And that made their empire so much stronger, and that's why they expanded so much. And you can see that in their origin story of Romulus and Remus, and Romulus's approach to getting citizens to live in Rome, this city that he's just founded. He's like, you're all welcome. The poor, everybody's welcome. You know, if you come here and you work as part of the city, you can be part of the city. So when you're thinking about origin stories and origin myths and tales defining, you know, the start of things, think about what values your culture has and what is your culture's weakness. Like, what is the thing that makes them teeter on that knife edge of collapse? And build that into that origin myth that kind of starts them off. And then you'll have a nicely organic story that they'll tell about, you know, how proudly they did that. And then people can be like, yeah, but he killed his brother. And they're like, yeah, we know. But, you know, nobody's perfect. Or maybe they say, well, yes, but his brother was wrong. You know, you have to do that. Like, sometimes you must kill your brother, or something equivalent. So think about that kind of approach and to creating your origin story. Like, what do people want to show about their culture, and what do they want to, and you know, and what is the flaw in their culture? Okay, so we've already spoken about this a little bit, but my next point is showing versus telling in mythology. And here I want to talk about some techniques for incorporating myths through characters, and where you can sort of not info dump exactly, but where you can get away with putting in a lot more content and so on. Okay, so first, let me just say why info dumping your myth, just straight up like dumping it in the middle of the text, isn't great. And it's the reason why info dumping isn't great in general. You lose the engagement of the reader. Readers generally don't read to experience your world. They read because your characters interest them. They read because they are attached to the character. So the problem with info dumping is it takes them away from the character and kind of just dumps them into the middle of the story. So what you ideally want to do is you want to have them experience the myth as a whole. Okay, and you want them to understand how it relates to the character. So I'm going to go back to sharing my screen a little bit, and here I'm going to talk a bit about how I did this as well. So one of the techniques that I used, and this is where you can get away with a little bit of info dumping, is I used flavored text on the top of my chapters. Now, Dune did the same thing. Frank Herbert has those flavored texts on the tops. There's books where Brandon Sanderson takes that approach and so on. And in your flavor text, as long as you don't put pages of it, if it's just like a paragraph or two, you can get away with a little bit of info dumping. And what this allows you to do is it allows you to put the myth in the style that you want to show to the reader. Right? So I'm going to read my two Kisangi myths and then explain the style that I was going for. Both of these are flavor text in the ducal air. So the first is, on the southern continent of Kisangi, to the west of the arm of the gods, lies the giant lake simply called the Holy Dam. In the center of the lake, there is a perfectly round, deep blue hole. The water of the hole is always clear, no matter the weather nor yet the season. It is said that a diver who is brave enough, or foolish enough, could plumb those depths and find the hub of the wheel, which the goddess pushed out when she gave her people the gift of Habi. There are always young men and a few young women who try this on their temple day. Most survive the experience. None have found the hub. Now, you can see that that is from a geography of Kisangi. So this is not a myth as such, but putting this flavored text on top of one of my chapters sets a scene for readers who are paying attention of what the hub is and what the Holy Dam is and so on. And that's important because there's a mural later on in the book that is in the northern continent that shows that same lake and that hub. And on top of that chapter, I then have a slightly different flavor text, which is the actual flavor, which is the actual myth, or speaks of the myth, where it is written that the goddess cracked the hub of the great wheel to bless her beloved people with a gift of Habi. It is said that she cried for the cracks in the wheel, even as her people gave thanks for the mighty gift. Every century there comes a star trailing fire to remind us of that day. On the day it hangs above the hole the hub made, we celebrate the gifts of the goddess and her consort, the right-hand god and the left-hand god. We give thanks so that the goddess may know that we see her grief and appreciate her gifts. So this builds on the previous one because it then provides you with the context of the myth of how this hub came to be and how this ritual works. And then you go into the chapter, and in the chapter you see this mural of that same dam and the comet. Tannerus left a comment. My favorite use of flavor text was excerpts of a history book written a century after the events of the chapter. There wasn't a lot of resemblance between them. Yes, that is a great way to do it. My only hesitation would be you are then explicitly telling the reader that there is a future after the story. So you have to be careful that you don't kind of not spoil or anything, but that you don't set it up so that the reader's like, but I know everything works out, because there is this history book. But yes, using history, even as recently as 100 years, versus the events that actually happened, do not have to be the same. So you can definitely utilize flavor text as a method of putting myths directly in. You can also utilize your, if I just go back to, you can also utilize your appendices for the same thing. I was going through my copy of Game of Thrones and I found that George R.R. Martin actually has appendices at the back where he's got those houses of his, and in there he actually mentions Naira again and tells you that she was part of the Roinar people who married the Dornish prince and founded the Dornish house. Marinan says it's hard to draw someone into your world and also the character's personality at the same time. Dragonlance had me hooked because they managed to pull this off. Yes, absolutely. It is hard to combine world building and people. And I'm not gonna lie, I don't know if I do this perfectly, but I do try, and I will read to you how I try and do this with my creation myth and how I try to do that through one character speaking to another. So we've spoken about flavor text, but you can also use festivals, as we spoke about, like the midwinter festival, or you can have a kind of a New Year's celebration, or you think about how you can use festivals to have things happening, drawing people into the world as well as introducing your characters. And then, of course, you can always utilize the natural discussion between people, especially if you have one character who knows the myth and one character who does not. So I'm going to go to my writing again. And I use my writing as an example, not because I think I'm all that in a bag of chips, but because I know that I'm legally allowed to use my own writing, and I'm not sure how much I am legally allowed to use of anybody else's writing. So hence why I use my own, and let me know what you guys think if I achieved organically bringing the world out. So this is in the second book, in Ducal Heir. Louis is hurt, or he's just been healed from being hurt, and he is in a forest. He's just met Naira and her husbands. He knows very little about them. So Louis awoke with a start, footsteps, knife leaping into his hand. He jerked upright in his bedroll. But it was only Raoul, returning from standing watch. Are you all right? Raoul whispered. Louis lay down again. Yes. Raoul crawled into his bedroll next to Alunt, and Louis tried to sleep. The healing skin on his legs twitched and pinched. His thoughts skittered and bounced over each other, refusing to be still. They wanted to return to the cell, to live through the memories again. Wrestling with his mind, he turned and saw Naira sitting by the fire. Can't sleep? Louis asked her. Glass charms on her bracelets caught the light as she poked a stick into the coals. No. The fire invaded the baubles on her wrists, turning them red and orange. They fascinated him, driving away the memories of the closed cell. So here I'm also emphasizing the Sawa charms, which we know from the rest of the book that they are very important religious symbology to Naira. So why are there images inside those beads? They are Sawa signs of the gods and their animals. Each charm is a prayer. She held the bracelet up to the fire. The breath of the goddess and the two-tailed lion, the sun crown of the right-hand god and the life-giving bee, the fire of the left-hand god and the moss rocks. The spectre of his memories faded as he focused on her words. They had brought him calm earlier. Could she help him again? Tell me of your gods, Louis asked. There is much to tell. I can speak of the beginning. Please. Shadows leaped around them, reaching into the rustling forest as Louis settled on his side. It might be that the words come hard, she said, but I will try. It is said that before everything there was darkness so complete none knew what rode there. Maybe spirits from before, maybe the threesome themselves. But of the darkness nothing is written, only said. She paused frequently to search for words, and in those pauses Louis's eyes grew heavier, sleep edging nearer. This is what is written. The right-hand god was born and brought light and life. The left-hand god made darkness come back. Between them stood the goddess, and she balanced them. Every morning, the right-hand god would bring life to a new world. Every evening, the left-hand god would destroy it. Every day, the goddess would study the life of the world, a bridge between her husbands. The goddess became tired of seeing a new world every day. She wanted more time to study the life and death of creation. She did not want a new world every day. And so she made the wheel. It stands guard between the place of the gods and our world. Life grew, plant to animal and animal to man. Man learned what the gods were, and man called for help. The goddess opened the hub of the wheel, and the power from her home flowed through. Knowledge spread among us, teaching her people hobby. They say the goddess was distracted because her husbands fought about which humans they should bless. In her distraction, her hand slipped, and a piece of the hub tumbled to the earth. But that is only said. What is written is that a mighty star fell onto the plain of Kisanghi, and it made the hole the hub made, and around it grew the holy dam. Her voice faded into the call of the hunting owl, and Louis smiled as he fell asleep, a peaceful dream telling him of things that were written, and things that were only said. So, what I was trying to do there was firstly, pull together all of those threads of things from the flavor text to show how the myth actually comes together for the creation myth. So I've already had the reader, go over the little bits of pieces of the flavor text. And then it's also obviously how it impacts on Louis, who is currently suffering from, a form of PTSD as he's been through a very heinous event, and this story brings him some calm. And of course, I'm also trying to show the reader what the actual creation myth is in full, which is not to say that this is what truly happened, it's just what these people believe. So you can use that kind of conversation between characters to organically tell a mythological story, but be careful that you don't just go and dump the whole thing in one huge chunk of dialogue. That's still an info dump. What you want is you want to separate them paragraph by paragraph. Give the reader some time to absorb that paragraph while the character who is hearing the myth also absorbs that paragraph. And how does that paragraph make them feel? that then helps the reader contextualize and understand the myth. So, yeah, I hope that worked for you guys in terms of avoiding info dumps and showing and not telling. And the last thing that I want to talk about in terms of mythology is how you can make it central to a character's journey. And in this, I feel that the real masterclass is from George R.R. Martin, and it is Bran's character journey. So Bran goes on a truly epic journey where, he's, of course, famously thrown out of the tower in book 1, and then he recovers somewhat, and eventually he goes on this journey with the reeds, and they go beyond the wall. And Bran's journey is about finding out what is in the Weirwoods, finding out about green seeing and becoming the Green Man. And he basically goes on an entire mythological quest to become this green seer in the center of the tree. And I just think that it was so well done, the way that, the myth slowly spun out. At the beginning, in the first books, we just know about the Weirwoods and we know that they have faces. That's all we really know about them. And then slowly, over the course of the books, more and more of the mythology unfolds as we learn about the connected nature of the Weirwoods. And then finally we meet the guy who's in the middle of it, who can see through the Weirwoods. And then Bran takes his place, and Bran can see through the Weirwoods. And then, the TV series, I hope, shows us what was Martin's original notes, which is that he then could see and could then experience those visions. Of course, what he did to Hodor was not great, but so that whole journey of Bran's was a whole exploration of the mythology in a very showy way and in a very intense way that inhabited the character's entire arc. I did have some other things that I was going to talk about, but I have been talking for 42 minutes, so I'm going to stop and check if there's any chats that I've missed, but it seems that you guys are happy enough. So I'm going to close this live stream there. It's been great to spend time with you guys. Did you guys enjoy the sharing of the screen bit? Did the readings work for you, or would you rather I skip those in the past? Let me know in the comments. I have one from Marianne. It's probably easier to do something in regards to a setting's mythology by having characters that are divine in origin. I mean, yes and no. So, remember, myths don't have to be real. Like, I don't think any of the Greek gods are real, but there's a lot of myths about them. I'm glad you enjoyed them. And I'm glad that you guys enjoyed the stream and the screen sharing. And yeah, I'll keep it around. And then I will see you in 2 weeks. There will be a poll about the next 2 things that you want me to stream about. So make sure you're subscribed and check out the community tab occasionally. Okay. Thanks very much. Have a great day.